Hello there, everyone. I am coming to you from the sunny beaches of San Diego. It is early in the morning, so there's not that many people here, although you'll probably see and hear some action around me. And it's also still in the winter months, so it's a little chilly still here on the beach, but it will warm up and I won't need these jackets in the next few hours. In this video, I wanted to talk about one more resource that I am delving into right now, actually, that is leading me to feel a little bit more hopeful about the world around us. You know, when we talk about the topic of institutional oppression, as we have said again and again and again throughout the semester, as you've probably experienced yourself, or if you're not in this class, if you're not in my institutional oppression class, you're likely experiencing in your own way, it can be really hard to feel hopeful for change because things have been the way that they are for so very long, in this country, globally, on all of the levels. So it can lead us in a state of oftentimes feeling as though only bad things are happening around us, as though there may not be any hope for a solution, as though we have no idea what solutions there may even be that would work, etc. And you know, what I've found to be true in my own experience is that, and a lot of spiritual leaders, a lot of different thought leaders speak on this as well, is what we look for we find, right? If I'm constantly looking out to the world around me and looking for signs of injustice, yes, it's a very important skill to develop, right? Like, we need to be able to open our eyes and see clearly what's happening out there. But just as important as it is to develop our ability to identify when issues of injustice or things that are not good are happening, it's also really important for us to be able to develop the skill of identifying the good things too. If we're only ever looking for the negative, we will probably only ever see the negative because it's really easy to see right now. It's really easy to see right now. When we hone our skills, when we build our brain's capacity to look at the world around us and also identify signs of hope, it's the same pattern that plays out there. After a certain point, we just start seeing it. We can't really even control it necessarily. It just becomes part of our brain's functioning, is looking for those signs of hope in the world as well. So my ultimate point is, if it doesn't feel very natural to you yet to look out at the world around you and find things that you think like, oh, this is part of the future of social change. Oh, this is where I believe the future is heading. Oh, look at these signs that the future I know is true in my heart is evolving, is coming out. So I've done that. I speak on this from personal experience because I've done that. I've helped my brain learn how to identify the good in addition to the not so good in the world around me. And one of the things, to bring us back to this video, one of the things that is bringing me hope these days is this book. This is a book that I'm reading right now as I'm recording this video, at least, about nonviolent communication. So it's a pretty well-known book. The author actually created I believe it's an International Institute of Nonviolent Communication. So, you know, there's a lot of resources and information about this type of communication out there. I would add that, you know, there's some valid critique of this communication style, of this book, of this topic, as there is of everything. You know, we can look out and see all these signs of hope. It doesn't mean that any one thing is perfect and the only answer, right? Hopefully we know that when it comes to tackling issues related to institutional oppression, there's going to be millions of different answers because there are millions of different ways that institutional oppression has come to be woven into the fabric of our society. There's going to be just as many ways that we need to eradicate it, that we need to address it, that we need to heal it. So this is not a perfect approach. I say that to just honor that this is not a perfect approach, but it really has some strong potential for shifting the way we speak. But what I'm finding as I'm delving into this book, that more so than being just about the language that we use, this book is about the paradigms that we hold in our head. This book is about the belief system through which we view the world in terms of how do we perceive other people. Because of course the way that we perceive things influences the way that we respond to them. So how we are perceiving individual people, how we're perceiving our clients, how we're perceiving our partners, how we're perceiving our relatives, how we perceive strangers on the street, how we perceive different marginalized identity groups, how you might feel when someone who looks different from you walks by you on the street. You know, all of those things are part of these subconscious processes that we all hold inside of us, and it influences how we react to those people, and therefore influences how those people react to us. Part of the reason why we live in such a polarized world right now is because of some of those issues, is because of these paradigms and belief systems we've built up in our heads about the other. We make up stories about them, we place judgments on them, and then we treat them as though those stories and judgments that we've created in our own heads are true. This influences how, the energy that they can feel that we're sending towards them. This influences how they're going to respond to us. And this is ultimately how we shape a lot of our social reality. And this is something that I really found to be true in my own experience. Especially coming into teaching, suddenly I had to really start looking at the way that other people were making me feel, and the way that certain types of populations that I had created narratives for and stories in my head about, I had to confront them because I could see how directly it was impacting my ability to have a relationship with certain types of populations, right? With those populations that I myself had been built up, that I had grown up in an environment that led me to believe subconscious biases, prejudices, judgments, stories, narratives, etc. about these other people. So the good news is that we can unprogram that. Teaching was really helpful for me in that way too. I was able to identify when those processes were playing out inside of me. I was able to see how they were influencing my ability to communicate, to connect, to relate to that person, how it changed that person's reactions towards me as well. And that was where I was able to start figuring out, how do I change that within me? How do I shed some of these stories and narratives that I've been built up in my head to be true about these other populations? Okay, well, I don't want this video to just be about me, so let me read you. I wanted to read you just like a couple little excerpts from this book. If you are in my class, you'll probably be reading the first chapter overall, but I wanted to just make a couple points that I find really interesting and meaningful. So the author of this book basically says, I've been preoccupied most of my life with two questions. What happens to disconnect us from our compassionate nature, leading us to behave violently and exploitively? And conversely, what allows some people to stay connected to their compassionate nature even under the most trying circumstances? To sort of set the tone of how deep this paradigm can look, how big this can be, how expansive this perspective can be when you develop it. I wanted to read a little excerpt here that the author included that's actually from Eddie Hillisum in A Diary, 1941 to 1943. It's a woman who was captured in a German concentration camp back in Nazi Germany. So this is from her diary. Her book is called A Diary, 1941 to 1943. So in this excerpt she said, I am not easily frightened. Not because I am brave, but because I know that I am dealing with human beings and that I must try as hard as I can to understand everything that anyone ever does. And that was the real import of this morning. Not that a disgruntled young Gestapo officer yelled at me, but that I felt no indignation, rather a real compassion, and would have liked to ask, did you have a very unhappy childhood? Has your girlfriend let you down? Yes. He looked harassed and driven, sullen and weak. I should have liked to start treating him then and there, for I know that pitiful young men like that are dangerous as soon as they are let loose on mankind. Now, if this woman who was trapped in a concentration camp, watching the things that we know took place at that concentration camp, and was able to hold this sort of perspective, like, wow, that was really inspirational and aspirational. When I read that, I felt like, if she was able to see someone's human in that moment and not label this person as an evil human being, which is really easy and compelling to do, especially in the moments when we're watching injustice happen. Instead, she was able to look deeper, right? Instead, she was able to see this person's human still and not condone his behaviors, not agree with his behaviors, not, issue any kind of positive judgment or excuse anything that is the choice that this person is making, but understand, right? But understand. Understanding why someone is the way they are does not excuse it. It does not make what they're doing okay. It allows for us to hold their human, right? It allows for us to hold their human. In this book, one of the things he talks about in presenting this, it's basically a template for how to engage in a communication, dialogue, etc., especially when there's some sort of disconnect or some sort of emotional disconnection between two people where there's confusion or messages getting crossed, etc. So this book basically presents a template for how to engage in a communication pattern that's going to be helpful, healthy, productive, a win-win sort of scenario where it's not two people trying to argue who's right and who's wrong here, but instead people are trying to find common ground, trying to understand and show compassion to one another. So one of the things that he talks about in this book is communication patterns that block compassion. I want you to listen to this and reflect on your own experiences of how you have been taught to hold this view about other people, and specifically the ways in this country, in the United States, that we are on a macro, a much larger scale, being taught to view people in really terms of moralistic judgment. So this section is about moralistic judgments. He says, one kind of life-alienating communication is the use of moralistic judgments that imply wrongness or badness on the part of people who don't act in harmony with our values. Such judgments are reflected in language. The problem with you is that you're too selfish. She's lazy. They're prejudiced. It's inappropriate. Blame, insults, put-downs, labels, criticism, comparisons, and diagnoses are all forms of judgment. The Sufi poet Rumi once wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." Life-alienating communication, however, traps us in a world of ideas about rightness and wrongness, a world of judgments. It is a language rich with words that classify and dichotomize people and their actions. When we speak this language, we judge others and their behavior while preoccupying ourselves with who's good, bad, normal, abnormal, responsible, irresponsible, smart, ignorant, etc. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The relationship between language and violence is the subject of psychology professor O.J. Harvey's research at the University of Colorado. He took random samples of pieces of literature from many countries around the world and tabulated the frequency of words that classify and judge people. His study showed a high connection between frequent use of such words and frequency of incidents. In other words, the more labeling language a country tended to use, the higher their level of violence as well. Go figure. The author says, it does not surprise me to hear that there is considerably less violence in cultures where people think in terms of human needs than in cultures where people label one another as good or bad and believe that the bad ones deserve to be punished. To bring it home, in 75% of the television programs shown during hours when American children are most likely to be watching, the hero either kills people or beats them up. This violence typically constitutes the climax of the show. Viewers, having been taught that bad guys deserve to be punished, take pleasure in watching this violence. At the root of much, if not all, violence, whether verbal, psychological, or physical, whether among family members, tribes, or nations, is a kind of thinking that attributes the cause of conflict to wrongness in one's adversaries, and a corresponding inability to think of oneself or others in terms of vulnerability. That is, what one might be feeling, fearing, yearning for, missing, etc. I hope you have already been thinking about some examples in your own life of where you feel as though you have been taught these messages, taught to view people in these kinds of terms. I know what immediately came up for me in terms of specifically some of these modern cultural issues that we're watching play out. Immigration is a huge one. The way that immigrants are talked about. The Black Lives Matter protests and ways that behavior has been labeled and talked about. I think of criminal justice, our criminal justice field, the way that people are, quite literally labeled as felons, as whatever their crime was, as inmates. I mean, my goodness, look at the dynamics that play out within systems of incarceration, right? Like, talk about labels. Some of these might be making you uncomfortable. Maybe the one that I'm going to give now is uncomfortable. But, we need to go there. When we are talking about how to build a community, a society of compassion, we can't do that unless it extends to everyone, right? So now I want us to think about some of the events that we've been watching play out within the last year, within the last few months. I want to think about, the issues that we've seen happen at our Capitol. The ways that we talk about people is coming from all sides, right? Like the labels are coming from all sides. And I'm not, again, saying that we should excuse anyone's behavior. I'm not saying that we should never, ever use labels. I'm just saying that when we place people into categories in any sort of a way, we place limitations on who that person is being viewed as, right? We place limitations on the person, we confine them into one tiny box, we let one aspect of their behavior, of who they are, speak for their entire existence. And as social workers, as people who care about other people, as people who, more importantly, want to understand other people, because hopefully we know that's ultimately where the root of change is in understanding. I think we can push ourselves to sit with the discomfort of having strong personal feelings, strong feelings of disapproval of other people's behaviors, other people's choices, other people's belief systems, while also striving to, not hold labels, not hold those sorts of barriers in our hearts. This language that we've all been taught teaches us to blame other people for their circumstances, ties right in with American individualism, this whole better pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you are poor in this country, it's because you are choosing to be poor, you are lazy. Same thing when we label people. You are a criminal, you are bad, I write you off. You are this political party, you are bad, I write you off. You had this specific behavior, you are bad, I write you off. We see so much of this is taught to us by the world around us, by news programming, by radio shows, by TV shows, by our political leaders. We live in this culture where, we develop these ideas about people in our head, ultimately stemming from this belief that people are somehow innately evil. And I really want us to question this, right? I really want us to question this. We are so inundated with this message, it's often very subconscious, but I want you to watch how you respond to other people. These notions of this person is a bad person, I want you to watch for when those come up within you. And I just want you to question them, right? Like, this is not easy stuff to unlearn. When you catch yourself doing this, when you see these sorts of moralistic judgments coming out, it's a sign that we are disconnecting from ourselves. It's a sign that we are disconnecting from our human nature, and it's a sign to take a step back and reflect on the world that we want to be bringing about, and to do what we can to bring that out through us. Because the other side of this is, if as a culture we're able to make some shifts in the way that we communicate, in the way that we view ourselves, our choices, other people, the other side of this is, imagine what a world would look like where some of these practices were put into place on a macro level scale. Like the stuff that we do on the ground level can ripple up and create these macro level changes. Ultimately, that's what culture shifts do. They ripple outwards and end up influencing policies, practices, etc., because the way that society views something has shifted and changed. And that's something we can do. With resources like this book and many others that I'm sure are out there that talk about how to increase our compassion and open our hearts to one another and start believing in the goodness of humans instead of looking for the innate evilness. Warming up out here a bit. So the final piece that I wanted to read is another form of communication that blocks compassion that felt to me pretty relevant for common cultural issues within the United States. So this is denial of responsibility. He says, another kind of life alienating communication is denial of responsibility. Communication is life alienating when it clouds our awareness that we are each responsible for our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. The use of the common expression have to, as in, there are some things you have to do, whether you like it or not, illustrates how personal responsibility for our actions can be obscured in speech. The phrase makes one feel, as in, you make me feel guilty, is another example of how language facilitates denial of personal responsibility for our own feelings and thoughts. In her book Eichmann in Jerusalem, which documents the war crimes trial of Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann, Hannah Arendt quotes Eichmann, saying that he and his fellow officers had their own name for the responsibility-denying language that they used. They called it Amtssprache, loosely translated into English as office talk or bureaucraties. For example, if asked why they took a certain action, the response would be, I had to. If asked why they had to, the answer would be, superior's orders, company policy, it's the law. I want you to think of some of the ways that this sort of language plays out in the world around you. Maybe you can think of examples from your experience in nonprofit worlds where you have heard other people say, or maybe you've been a person who said, I don't really want to, but I guess I have to. It's company policy. Sorry, client, I know this isn't in your best interest, but I have to. Uncomfortable truths, right? Like, we don't need to have good answers. We don't need to have the right thing to say. We don't need to have the ability to, single-handedly shut down a policy. We don't in a lot of ways. However, this is making a point about the language that we use. So some other examples he talks about when we deny responsibility for our actions. Sometimes we attribute them to factors outside of ourselves, such as vague impersonal forces. I cleaned my room because I had to. Our condition, our diagnosis, our personal or psychological history. I drink because I'm an alcoholic. The actions of others. I hit my child because he ran into the streets. Gender roles, social roles, or age roles. I hate going to work, but I do it because I'm a husband and a father. There are a lot of ways that this comes up. And there's two pieces that I want to touch on here. So first of all, one of the things that I didn't speak about in the last example is mental health diagnoses, specifically the DSM. When we talk about labeling language in this country, when we talk about labeling language within the realms of the helping profession, the DSM is a huge example. Again, I'm not saying that it's never useful to have a term to, describe common traits of people's behaviors with. That can be useful. It's when we attribute that to their identity that the problems begin, right? That person is a schizophrenic. That person is bipolar. That person is depressed. There are ways to talk about things that people are experiencing without attributing their entire identity to one specific thing. Again, let's think about how this influences the helping profession, right? If I have a paradigm that I believe that my client is their mental health label, they were born that way, they're permanently that way, that is who they are, that is going to influence my interactions with them, right? I'm probably not going to listen to them as much as I would a quote normal person. I'm probably not going to, ask their thoughts, ask their opinion, get their involvement and engagement in the treatment plan if I think that, if I write them off as they're just mentally ill. It influences the way that I perceive them, it influences the way that I act towards them. This influences their own perception of themselves, right? Also, if you are someone who's had a mental health diagnosis, you might have had that experience too of, okay, well, this is all that I am. So I don't know what's best for me. I don't know what's right for me. I should probably question my own ideas and assumptions. I need somebody else to tell me. And that's what these labels can do. The labels have power behind them. So the second piece that I want to focus on here, he sort of explains a little bit further in this example where he was consulting for a school district and a teacher that he was working with remarked, I hate giving grades. I don't think they are helpful and they create a lot of anxiety on the part of students. But I have to give grades. It's the district policy. We had just been practicing how to introduce language in the classroom that heightens conscious responsibility for one's actions. I suggest the teacher translate the statement, I have to give grades because it's district policy, to, I choose to give grades because I want, ... She answered without hesitation, I choose to give grades because I want to keep my job. While hastening to add, but I don't like saying it that way. It makes me feel so responsible for what I'm doing. That's why I want you to do it that way, I replied. And he has another little text box excerpt here that says, we are dangerous when we are not conscious of our responsibility for how we behave, think, and feel. Now that might be another example that brings up some feelings of discomfort, especially if you are someone who has used that phrase, and I know I have, so let me own that too. I know I have used the phrase, I don't think this is best practice, but this is policy, so this is what I have to do. Now this isn't saying that we should just, get ourselves fired or take single-handed responsibility for a professional policy, but he's saying be honest. He's saying be honest with ourselves. It takes us out of this world where we have no control. It takes us out of this world where things happen to us, and it puts us at the helm a little more. When we can say, I am choosing to follow this policy because I am choosing to keep my job, because I want to keep my job, that's honest. When we say we have to, that's not necessarily honest, and that's one of those ways that these social conditioning issues, let's think back to the first part of this that I read, where This was how things were in Nazi Germany. This was how that they taught people to behave, to fully enforce what was unrolling there. You have to. You don't have a choice. Those sorts of belief systems are taught to us in a way that keeps us oppressed, in a way that keeps us buying into sustaining institutional oppression. The more often we can rightly state the scenario, which is, I am choosing to participate in this because X, Y, Z, the more often we remind ourselves and other people around us that we always have a choice. We all have a choice. And we get to choose what sort of reality we want to hold and what we want to perpetuate. Even if we can't change a policy, by phrasing it this way in our mentalities, we remind ourselves that the only reason a policy is a policy is because people participate with us. With it, I mean. And if enough people choose to stop participating with the policy ceases to exist. I want to wrap up here with a couple pieces from this last segment. He says, most of us grew up speaking a language that encourages us to label, compare, demand, and pronounce judgments rather than to be aware of what we are feeling and needing. I believe life-alienating communication is rooted in views of human nature that have exerted their influence for several centuries. These views stress humans' innate evil and deficiency and a need for education to control our inherently undesirable nature. Now, this sounds a lot like colonization. And if you've not read the book on Indigenous Peoples' History, because you're not in this class, I would really encourage you to, because it paints a really powerful view of how colonization is not just the process of taking land. Colonization is the process of indoctrinating all of us with belief systems, with paradigms, with perspectives, with feelings of being helpless, with fear of other people. That's how these systems of oppression perpetuate. That's how all of this perpetuates. One of the most important things we can do on an individual level in order to then ripple change outwards on a more macro level is to address how these things are showing up within ourselves, to start from within and then use that as a tool to send those waves without. The more people who are trained to think in these moralistic judgments that imply wrongness and badness, the more they are being trained to look outside themselves to outside authorities for the definition of what constitutes right, wrong, good, and bad. When we are in contact with our feelings and needs, we humans no longer make good slaves, servants, or underlings. So ultimately, that's what this book is about. It's about returning power, returning compassion to ourselves so that we can turn that to other people, so that we can, move beyond some of the really deeply entrenched, really deeply ingrained processes in this country that so heavily involve labeling, wrongdoing, etc. The way things are is already so deeply ingrained in society around us. If anyone can be the folks who are going to start to ripple this change outwards, it's the people who are in positions where they help other people. It's the people who are in positions where the purpose is to understand other people, because we ultimately know that understanding is the way to change on an individual level and on an external level. That is my motivation to share with you today, is to just do a little bit of reflection of how these messages of labeling, of wrongness, of helplessness are coming up in your consciousness, are coming up in your worldview, so that you can start to evaluate, am I really helpless here? Why do I feel like I have to do this thing? Why do I feel like I have to follow this policy? If I'm choosing to follow this policy, that's fine, but let me say it for what it is. And why do I feel the need to label these other people? What happens when I label people? When I feel these gut reactions towards others who are different from me or who are similar to me, what does that mean? What can I do with that? This is the lens through which we start to be the change that we truly want to see in the world around us. This is the lens through which we ripple macro level change out through micro level cosms. The micro is what becomes the macro. So when we shift our consciousness, when we shift our paradigms on a micro level, we change the way we relate to the world around us, we change the possibilities we see, we open up new pathways, we become role models and possibility models for others as well in the future that we all ultimately want to create here. I think I'll leave you with some view of the ocean to enjoy, and I will see you next time.